Esther Stutzman is Kalapuya for what's up? Greetings, relatives. Welcome to DiversiTV Season 2. Today, as always, since we're on Wapakisinep, Turtle Island, we are beginning with a native perspective. But before we get into that with our guest tonight, I want to give you kind of an overview of what DiversiTV is. Go to slide if you would, guys. So DiversiTV's mission is to illuminate everyday diversity issues from the point of view of Lane Community College's definition of diversity, which attempts to be as evolving and all-inclusive as possible, and to give the mic and the camera to those who don't always get the mic and the camera. Our Season 2 schedule, starting today with Native Perspective, next week Anglo, and the following week Africans in America, Latino Perspective, October 24th, October 31st, Asian Perspective, November 7th, Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer, Questioning, Two Spirits, all the various names. November 14th, Disability, November 21st, Youth, and ending, let's see, November 28th, Class, and December 5th, last show before we recycle for winter term, Spirituality and Religion. And what we'll attempt to do, it's a first for us, is not only look at the so-called Abrahamic religions, but also look at how indigenous religions are usually not included in the conversation about spirituality and religion, and try and have a conversation about why that is so, and also to attempt to correct that 500-year-old wrong, where, for example, no one would think about scaling the cathedral at St. Paul's or St. Peter, but, for example, when the Lakota Nation asks Anglo climbers not to climb on what is referred to in English as the Bear's Lair, or also known as the Devil's Tower, they get flack for that. So, Native spirituality does not always get the same standing as, for example, Christianity or Judaism or Islam. Tulipit Wapakisinep, which is the indigenous name, one of the indigenous names for the continent, named after the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci. Tulipit Wapakisinep means the long-reaching land, and also Turtle Island. The concept is basically that you have one land, many nations, no borders. Known in ancient Alkebulan as Atalanta. The Atalanta is basically Comedian, or what you know by its Greek name, Egypt. It's the Egyptian name for this continent because there was a trading relationship starting back at least as far as 1000 BC or more. So there was a relationship between peoples of Alkebulan, Africa, and Turtle Island. And Alkebulan, known as Land of the Blacks. Also, again, the same concept, many nations, many nations within that particular continent. One of the things that we talked about last season, if you had caught some of last season, we basically often ask a question for each topic torn from the headlines, and this one basically can be found at this web link and deals with Congresswoman Diane Watson, Congresswoman basically expressing disapproval of the expulsion of Cherokee freedmen. And just this particular headline, the amendment demonstrates the gravity of the issue. Additional congressional actions may be forthcoming. This is the basic issue. Today, the House of Representatives adopted an amendment to limit their funds to the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma if the tribe fails to uphold the membership rights of the Cherokee freedmen. The amendment was attached to H.R. 2786, the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Reauthorization Act of 2007. The legislation approves housing assistance to American Indians and Alaska Natives. During the floor debate, Congressman Watt of North Carolina offered amendment to prevent funds authorized under that act from being expended for the benefit of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma until it recognizes the Cherokee freedmen, descendants, as citizens of the Cherokee Nation. Watt's amendment, and basically as long as the tribe's temporary injunction reinstated the freedmen remains in effect, and if the Cherokee freedmen prevail in its appeal of the nation's March 3rd vote, rescinding the tribal membership of the Cherokee freedmen. Congresswoman Watson issued the following statement. The fact that the Cherokee freedmen issue has been raised on the floor of the House of the Representatives demonstrates the gravity of the issue. The amendment language clearly puts Congress on record that the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma will not be in compliance with the 1866 treaty, which recognizes the freedmen as citizens if it takes any action through its courts or otherwise expels the freedmen descendants from tribal roles. The amendment also sends a clear signal that Congress will continue to monitor the situation closely. The Cherokee Nation does not move expeditiously in a manner indicating that it will comply with its treaty obligations. Rep. Watson, she remains concerned. It's her understanding that the Cherokee Nation has eliminated from the official webpage references on how freedmen descendants can apply for citizenship and refused outside requests for enrollment records and refers to freedmen as non-Indians. So to continue, and our guest tonight, Gifford Tallmadge, who is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. Quoting our email conversations, Gifford and I have a long association with Lane's Rites of Passage. He is one of the leaders and instructors of UMISTA, which Lane has a summer Rites of Passage program for youth of color. And UMISTA is the one for those of Native heritage. Welcome.
Thank you.
You've described yourself as having a dual citizenship of a Native nation and by accident of birth an American. Can you speak to that?
I can, and I'd be glad to. I was born a Cherokee, and the Cherokee Nation is the one that I associate with the closest. My mother was born in what was Indian Territory. Her citizenship at the time was that of the Cherokee Nation. She was allotted citizenship as a U.S. citizen later on. And so that's what I identify with, and that's what I am closest to.
How about as an American?
Well, let's put it this way. I'm proud to be a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. There's a lot of things that I'm not proud that the United States is doing at this time. And I'll leave it at that.
I can definitely feel you on that. I've seen, in Eugene we deal with a lot of bumper sticker. I've seen bumper stickers saying, could be prouder.
Yes.
And definitely in terms of looking at some of the things that we're doing now and that have been done, especially to divide historical allies. I mean, that definitely, the Freedmen situation definitely speaks to that. I guess in a nutshell, because you yourself have encouraged me to, seek enrollment, being enrolled in part of the Choctaw Nation. And I've gone round and round about that because of that citizenship issue of, not so much that I feel proud to be an American citizen, because in the words of the Delaney sisters, I may love America, but America doesn't always love me back in the same way. So in looking at, for example, our second question within Cherokee cosmology, what would it mean to be a full-blooded citizen? Because you use that term, and you know, when a local political figure talks about being a red-blooded American, and that, I'm not sure exactly what that means, except, you know, when he's referring to it, it's kind of like, it's a Ku Klux Klan saying, and they're basically talking about pure blood white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and that being American. And I've heard that phrase used in, you know, my classes, where people say, well, I'm an American, and, you know, well, I'm not, and in that context, well, I'm not an American because I have a darker suntan, or they think I'm Rastafarian because of my hairstyle or whatever, right? So what does that mean to be a full-blooded citizen within your worldview, your national worldview?
Well, within the cosmology and how one and how the Cherokee people think of themselves, it has nothing to do with the blood quantum. The blood quantum is something that has arbitrarily been enforced on us by the U.S. government. And I think more importantly by the dominant culture in an attempt to divide us even amongst ourselves. In Cherokee belief, in Cherokee cosmology, the idea of being a full blood is carrying those tenets of what the Cherokee beliefs are. And so when we use those terms, we're not talking about blood. What we're talking about is the culture.
What aspects of the culture in particular do you resonate strongly with?
Well, probably many of those aspects.
Okay.
The belief in our creation, the beliefs about how we are in the world, what it means to be a good Cherokee. And by that, I mean there is a responsibility that we owe. That responsibility, among other things, is to try and always do the right thing to protect the people. And I believe in those things very strongly.
You and I were participants, you more completely than I, but participants recently in Cherokee Nation history course, where they talked a little bit about the cosmology, but certainly the world, it wasn't as documented so much as the other things. I mean, we got this big, thick book, and talking about the Cherokee had originally, in these creation stories, come from this island that had sunk and then made this gradual voyage up, or journey up through what could have been Mexico to settle in the ancestral lands in Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, et cetera, Trail of Tears, and then the current residence in Oklahoma. What would it mean to be a Cherokee in the 21st century? And how do, you know, I mean, where do we come from? Where are we going? That, you know, when we talk about that cosmology, you know, what did you think of that? I mean, because you're a citizen. You claim that very strongly, so.
Yeah, I do, and I think that presentation, part of that was also based on the personal feelings and beliefs of the instructor of that. Mm-hmm. The Cherokee Nation, and you know, let us be clear that there are three entities that have federal recognition as representing Cherokees. Those being the Cherokee Nation, which is located in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, the Eastern Band of the Cherokees, which are reside within the boundary of the Quail Reserve in North Carolina, and then the United Katua Band, which also has their headquarters in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. If you would talk to an Eastern Band Cherokee, he would tell you there was no migration, that we were always here. This is where we come from, and this is where we'll always be. And so I think there is some interpretation of those origins for our people. Yes.
One of my teachers was Katua, mm-hmm. and to the degree that he would speak about that, I won't really reveal that here, but, you know, what about them? What are the distinctions between those three groups, politically, spiritually, culturally?
Well, I think at one time we used to define ourselves as being one people, that
Yes.
we're divided into three governmental organizations. I still believe that that's true. We're all Cherokee. Katua is a wonderful word, and many people use that to describe themselves. That's the term they use for being Cherokee. There was a particular town that was named Katua. This is in North Carolina, and it's where it was the mother town for us all. We have different beliefs in terms of what needs to be done for us as a people and where the government should go. But that in itself is traditional Cherokee. We always have a lot of discussions.
What was that saying? 3 Cherokees, 4 opinions? Or
Yes. Yes.
Well, of particular interest to me because, you know, I heard about that workshop and you invited me and, you know, I wanted to come check it out, you know, because of our interactions and, you know, it was for me, you know, as an ethnic studies teacher, okay, this is the first time that I'd seen a Native nation actually put together their own history and say, this is who we are, this is the official word. And I was troubled by some aspects of it, and you were too. I mean, we talked about that, and what was particularly troubling is how closely it seemed to position close to the Columbus narrative in terms of leaving certain things out. For example, I do a lot of, you know, when we started the broadcast, you know, I basically said, okay, Tulipit Wapakisinip, not America, right? This is Native. Mm-hmm. We're starting with Natives because we were here first, right? And I include myself in that, among that number, right? So from the point of view of many people of color, we would look at, okay, black people didn't just come here as slaves brought by Europeans. We had a trading relationship before Europe even began, before there even was a Europe. So there's that piece. But then even if you get in terms of agreement, in terms of Africans being brought by the Spanish in the 1500s and then escaping into Cherokee country, and that person that we were talking about that put together the workshop made no mention of that, showed a series of maps that basically said, okay, here's the colonists, you know, in our lands, and I asked the question, all right, so what was your relationship with the maroon communities, the escaped slaves that were living in those same mountains according to white folks? And because the map that you're showing me, now we're 30 years into slavery, which means there's like 500,000 Africans already in Turtle Island as slaves. How come you're not counting those folks? And what was your relationship with those folks? And she said, there wasn't one. Which, well, wait a minute. They're there. How come you don't count them? The white folks are saying they're there. You're not saying they're there. It almost seems, I mean, when we started the broadcast talking about the freedmen, it's like, okay, these folks were your citizens by treaty rights, and now you're saying that they're not. How do you come by that decision? It seems like you're constructing history that's leaving folks out.
Well, I really want to address this, and I want to make it clear that I'm speaking as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and not as a representative in any way of the Cherokee Nation's government.
Your own opinion.
My own opinion.
Yeah.
But certainly that interaction was going on at that time. And one of the things, and I think there's a great deal of misconceptions over the freedmen and what has taken place with the Cherokee Nation, as well as outside of it. And I think a lot of times what we end up doing is we're giving a set of words We're given a language to be able to look at things. Unfortunately for us, it doesn't address all of those parameters, all of those things that make us up as indigenous people. And so once again, we're limited in this discussion to utilizing what the dominant society has laid out for us. As you and I both have discussed this before, that relationship between what was a black African slave and what was a member of the Cherokee Nation at that time was not one of slave ownership. It was of interaction. It was of using the strengths of both parties to survive. And let's face it, that's what we're talking about. The Cherokee Nation has had contact with the dominant culture since the 1540s. All that time, the emphasis was on survival of the people. Yeah. And we've had hundreds of years that we dealt with the dominant culture, whether it be a government that was English, French, Spanish, or American. And the question that was always posed is, what is best for the people? What is best for us as a culture to survive, to keep that culture intact? And I think that's what you see today, is you see an outgrowth of three separate governments, one people, but the strength in being Cherokee and being a part of that culture is that we have survived. And that survival has, for us, has also meant that we need to acknowledge and be aware of all of our citizens. And if you want to get into the issue of the freedmen, and I read and listened to what you said about Diane Watson, particularly referring to the 1866 treaty. Ironically, this was a treaty that was imposed upon the Cherokee Nation by the federal government at that time, in essence to punish the Cherokee Nation. Right. And they used it as an excuse to take more land out of Indian territory. And I think we need to make it clear that the Cherokee Nation fought for the North. They fought for the North. Early in the history of the Civil War period and what went on between the southern states and the northern states was Indian territory was surrounded by southern states. Yeah. And we were forced to negotiate a treaty with the Confederacy. The Cherokee Nation did fight on the side of the South briefly, but also that was reversed, and it was reversed early on. The Civil War was devastating to the Cherokee Nation, and Abraham Lincoln had promised the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation that he would respect the boundaries of the Cherokee Nation. But once the war ended and Lincoln was gone, that was no longer the case. The 1866 treaty was a treaty that the Cherokees believe they were forced to sign.
So let me get this straight, because it sounds like you have an indigenous nation caught between two warring factions of America, or a white nation, essentially.
White America, yes.
White America. In an alliance with the North, briefly in an alliance, forced into an alliance with the South, briefly, but largely most of the time, if what you're saying is, because what I hear you saying is that largely, for most of the time, the alliance was with the North, even though briefly with the South.
That's correct.
Then the South loses, and then it sounds like then the North then says, okay, well, you fought with the South, however briefly, we're going to take your land, and as punishment, since we've freed the slaves now, right, even though the Cherokee model of slavery is not as property, But I mean, that's one of the issues, especially with the quote unquote Indian model of slavery from the point of view of the whites. Indians didn't treat their slaves correctly. In other words, they didn't beat them, didn't rape them. They weren't in chains. They were fed well, treated well, even though from what we understand, even being forced to use that word slave, it doesn't sound pretty in any case. But it is not the same as the South, because black slaves are running often into Indian country and then being incorporated as part of their nation. Not necessarily that may or may not be the relationship with the Cherokee, and you can speak to that more completely than I can, because you shared that, hey, my ancestors had slaves. So
yes, they did.
So, yeah, what was that model of slavery? Because we're not talking about the same thing like Uncle Tom's Cabin. We're talking about a different relationship.
Yeah, we are talking about a different relationship, and one of the things that the federal government did with the Cherokee people, there's a lot of good documentation. They took a lot of censuses. They took a lot of rolls. They looked at us fairly closely, just a lot of documentation about that. Subsequently, when my family was forced to relocate from the traditional homelands to Oklahoma, there was a census prior to that. And the census not only included the number of people in the household, those that spoke English, those that spoke Cherokee, the number of slaves that they may own, but it also included things as whether they were weavers, farmers, what livestock they had. And so when my family did go on the trail where we cried, which is known as the Trail of Tears, they did bring some African slaves with them. I think the difference is, though, is when we're talking about the interaction that went on between them. One of the things that you asked me earlier about a full-blood, and one of the definitions of that for a long time was those that spoke Cherokee. And that being part of the culture. And so part of that interaction, very often those African slaves, and I use that term loosely because it wasn't one of servitude, but it was one of being incorporated. Very often they were used as interpreters with the dominant culture. As you know, the Cherokee language, the Cherokee people have had a syllabary, an alphabet for a long time that was used, prior to the removal. 98% of the Cherokee people were literate. They both read and wrote Cherokee. And so we were a nation that really did focus on education of the people. We had a written language. It was a very beautiful language. But often that meant that we needed others to do the interaction with that dominant culture. And you had these wonderful African people that had linguistic abilities, that picked up the Cherokee and also were able to interact with the dominant culture in English.
One of, in terms of my family lore, I mean, from the Choctaw point of view, because the Choctaw and the Cherokee were, I always love that 5 civilized tribe thing, where, the whites called us civilized because, we had alphabets, we were literate, we, adopted some of their ways, but one of the points being my ancestors were multiliterate. I mean, teaching my class in the reality of what Al-Qaeda in Africa was. Here you have a continent which even today has 2,000 languages, and minimally you have to speak 5. And if you're a people of the book that is Muslim, Jewish, or Christian, that also means you're going to be literate as well. And so you're going to have a multilingual capability, and that was, in fact, the capability of every African slave imported here by the whites, and also the capability of every African that came here has explored 1,000 or so years before. So it would make complete sense that the Africans were able to interface with the larger culture on behalf of their adopted families because, well, that's what we do. We knew about white folks before they came here, and we'd be able to adopt any language because it was in our blood. So to hear you reframe full-blooded, not in the divisive blood quantum way, but full-blooded means you speak the language, you're literate, you're a culture bearer, and that you're fully able to keep the people alive and act in their most healthy interest.
Their healthy interest.
That's very powerful, a very powerful reframing.
One of the things I think that in addressing this issue, and once again we've allowed the dominant culture to frame it. I think for the Cherokee Nation and for the Cherokee people, the issue is not just the freedmen on the rolls, but we're actually talking about the sovereignty of the nation. And part of that sovereignty is being able to define what citizenship is for us. And the Cherokee Nation has an unusual relationship with the American government. Unusual from the aspect that the American government, by treaty, has recognized the Cherokee Nation as existing from when time began to be counted, and recognized that the Cherokee Nation existed long before the concept of the United States came about. And so subsequently you have a dealing of two nations that there is sovereignty attached to. I know sovereignty is something that's bannered around the Native community, the indigenous communities, and there is sovereignty for the indigenous nations here in Turtle Island. But in particular, the relationship between the United States government and the Cherokee Nation is truly one of the Cherokee Nation having sovereignty existing long before the United States came into existence. Even the way our government is set up, we have a principal chief. Now a lot of Native American entities have tribal chairmen. And this has to do with the way that they were organized. But I want to go back again, that the Cherokee Nation has existed long before there was an American government, and the United States has recognized that. And in light of that, the Cherokee Nation believes, including in the 1866 Constitution, where that was reaffirmed by the American government, that we do have a right to, the nation does have a right to define what citizenship is for them. And as we've been talking, that citizenship, that attribute of being Cherokee, is really one that we're looking at in terms of a cultural protecting of the nation and of the people.
It's important to note that that legal relationship, in case people who are either new to the show or even new to the concept of what sovereignty means. It means, legally speaking, the relationship is nation to nation, on the same plane as the United States making a treaty with Germany or England or any other quote unquote sovereign nation, which means you have borders, you can define who your citizens are, you can define membership, you can define all kinds of different things, and that
your form of government.
Your form of government. And for them then to recognize uniquely that the Cherokee Nation, Cherokee sovereignty began when time began to be counted, but not specifically to put, well, what does that mean for us today? I mean, it's nice to acknowledge that, but functionally, what does that mean if then you begin to reduce territory? You begin to say, well, if you don't do this, or because you did this, you lose your land, you lose these people. And even today, Because I know, Diane's a family friend, so it's like, okay, I understand why you're doing this, but, saying to the Cherokee, well, if you don't recognize these folks, we're going to, you're abrogating your treaty rights, which is now a wedge for us to eliminate you as a nation. I mean, that's potentially what that means, and that's troubling to me, because it sets an even more dangerous precedent.
I would agree with you on that, and I think unfortunately once again we've allowed other people to put this framework before us, and even the language that's being used. When we're talking about the freedmen, in particular, we're talking about those black Africans that were freed by the Cherokee Nation. And I want to make it clear that this was done long before the 1866 treaty. The Cherokee Nation had their own proclamation to free the slaves a few years before that. And in no way...
Before the Civil War, during the Civil War?
During the Civil War.
Okay, all right.
About the time of the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln gave. So the issue of the freedmen being on the rolls is separate from the issue of having African Americans that are Cherokee, because we do have African Americans that are Cherokee and have the full rights and citizenship of the Cherokee Nation. But once again, I want to go back that this argument is being framed for us. It's being used with the language of this dominant culture, which in many ways really doesn't address those things that are central and important to us as indigenous people. And one of the things that we need to do is to be able to look at it within our own framework. Let us define what those things are. Let's sit down and be able to discuss this, not using the divisive language that's been used against us for so long. I mean, with what's being proposed in Congress right now is very much the language of that dominant culture. And we need to be able to look at this in a different way. We need to be able to say it's time for us not to use this to divide us, but that we need to address this within our own framework, our own cultures, our own beliefs, our own values, and come together to discuss it. There are, legitimately, I think, from both groups that are looking at this, that they have some real concerns that need to be addressed. I would not like to see the Cherokee Nation give up the idea of defining who their citizens are. Yes. I think that's important for the government, the Cherokee government. I think it's important for the Cherokee people. And it's just a continuation of this long line of us being able to express who we are and what makes up our core beliefs. And, on the other hand, I understand the need of the freedmen to find some expression for their own unique status, too.
I participated in a conference, actually presented some of the slides that we had seen here for this conference. Basically, my talk was entitled 21st Century Maroons. Maroon is an indigenous term for a first-generation African native genetic and cultural hybrid. It's a Taino word, and it means wild and free. And so it speaks of, these ancient alliances that are, before, dominant culture of America. And one of the things, I've learned several things new here tonight, just in listening to you talk about, wait a minute, the Cherokee, it doesn't even matter whether it was before or, contemporary or just after the Emancipation Proclamation, but before the war was over, they freed their slaves?
Yes, they did.
Okay, so the motivation for doing that, without being forced, seems to indicate that there is some value there, an acknowledged value there. because at that conference, Marilyn Vann, who's one of the folks and one of the kind of principal plaintiffs in the lawsuit and all that kind of stuff, said, look, you know, we're on the rolls. My mom was on tribal council. We speak Cherokee, yada, yada, yada. Why are we being excluded here? And then, you know, among black folks, as we will do, right? Then why are blonde-haired, blue-eyed Cherokee considered Cherokee and we're not when we even have more blood quantum? And, you know, and again, when I'm talking about, all right, even to use the blood quantum thing is already to use that divisive wedge.
That's correct.
Because nobody defines sovereignty by blood. That whole thing. Let's go to slide for a second, because I'll show you this chart that was developed and to talk about where this blood quantum idea came from. Go to slide. All right, so it's hard to zoom in on this, but here's what this chart says. It says ideas of racial purity, blood quantum, blood thinning, half-breeds, applied on the left to First Nations. Good, center that and pan up the chart. So at the top, applied to First Nations. Now, it's useful to contextualize where this comes from, because this is the first time that this is even applied to human beings and where it came from. So it's not really in European history, but Africans enslaved Europeans before Europeans enslaved Africans. So, for example, the Moors, who had conquered Spain twice, basically enslaved millions of Europeans and basically made Europeans raise horses, the so-called, what's called Arabian horses. And so the reason that you have a quarter horse today is because it's 1/4 Arabian. And these Arabian horses were war horses. They were hand-fed. They understood a vocabulary of 50 words or more, and they're bred for battle. And so the reason you have these quarter horses is because a full-blooded Arabian is very, shall we say, spirited. And so what you're doing by interbreeding them with other horses is basically diluting that spirit, right? So that was never the idea behind human beings. Human beings are human beings, right? The concept of Semite invented in Egypt was basically talking about mixing a pure, quote-unquote, pure-blood Egyptian with something else. But beyond that, nobody thought about it, right? So applied to First Nations, you're 1/8 Indian for the purposes of removing land rights. That means if you go beyond 1/8, you're not Indian anymore. But applied to Africans, you're 1/64, or the one drop rule to deny access, equal access to voting and other things. So blood quantum for beginners. The following chart, basically, if you have a black, white, or Indian and black or whatever, you half to one parents. Black, it's mulatto. Indian, half-breed, or the Lakota word is Ieska. A quarter, 1/4, that means your grandparents. One of your grandparents is full-blood. Black, you're quadroon. 1/8, that is your great-grandparents. The federal Indian cutoff, and then black octoroon. Then 1/16, one of your great-great-grandparents is full-blood, and that was the old Cherokee cutoff, and then 1/32nd, and then finally 1/64th. Your great-great-great-great-grandparent is full blood, and then you're effectively still black, even though it's interesting to point out that a mulatto person could be blonde hair and blue-eyed the way, you know, you can't judge by appearance, but blonde hair and blue-eyed with straight hair, and one of your parents is black. So, but you're legally considered black until, 1/64th. So this would give you the impression then that black blood is stronger than native blood. No, it doesn't work that way. So it's not logical, but it was kind of like, Jefferson and company used this horse breeding schema to then impose it upon human beings, and that's where it came from. And a lot of native people then kind of adopted that concept lock, stock, and barrel without questioning it. And that was one of the things that was disturbing me during this Cherokee history course is, okay, here you have opportunities to build alliances, but you're accepting this divisive rule. So how do we get back to the strength where, okay, you speak our language, you're willing to adopt our spiritual views, you're contributing to the strength of the tribe, you're a full blood. And how do we get to that? And how do we get to that in the 21st century, if we will?
Well, that's a good question, Mark. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to kind of look at this in perspective. And what we're talking about is very much Cherokee. We're having those discussions. We're looking at those things. We're having to deal with issues that have been imposed upon us. And I think one of the things that will happen is there is some ongoing litigation that will get some resolve in some of the federal courts over this. I think one of the important things that the Cherokee Nation did was to finally say that the Constitution that we have, we need to be clear about what we're going to do with that. And you talked about the blood quantum and how it applies to First Nations, to Native Nations today. And I want to make it clear that this blood quantum is something that's imposed upon us by the federal government.
Clearly.
So
for a reason.
When we're talking about that, we're talking about the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Mm-hmm. And they issue this white card that tells you what your blood quantum is before you apply for tribal membership. So once again, we're looking. We have this outside entity that the constant pressure is on us to somehow to conform to what their standards are that they believe we should live up to. And I think one of the good things that occurred with the Cherokee Nation this year was to finally say that no, we do not need approval of the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the federal government to set our Constitution, because we are a sovereign nation. We have our own government, and we will define what's in there. We don't need to seek federal approval for this. And so that's one aspect of it. But I think we need to see this as being a series of issues that have come together at one time. Unfortunately, I think that it's not always clearly understood in that way.
Cherokee is a democracy.
Yes.
You voted as a citizen. I mean, you talked about your anguish, a couple of weeks ago about voting against excluding the freedmen, but having to vote for another issue that basically was central to sovereignty. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I can. The Cherokee Nation did have an election, and as citizens of the Cherokee Nation, I did indeed vote on that. As my own conscience dictated, being a good Cherokee, doing what I thought was right for the people, is I had to, my vote was cast against any exclusion of any group. Subsequently, I also had to vote in an election after that on this constitutional issue that I was talking about. And I found myself in the really strange position of having to cast a vote against the amendment because I felt it was important that I vote with my conscience.
Yeah, yeah. That is the bind with freedom. There is sometimes, and sovereignty. Even if you feel your nation is taking a wrong direction, as I often feel with America, it's like, okay, the only way that I can make it right is still by participating, even though when they make wrong decisions, I have to live with that and still try and turn it in the right direction as a good American or as a good Cherokee. You have encouraged me to become a Choctaw or to be a card-carrying member of the Choctaw Nation, and I resist that because of that whole recognizing the American government thing and the restrictions, where that is often a devil's bargain, I think, because it can be problematic, because you have to do things that are buying into the oppression that doesn't make you a very free person.
I would agree that very often there are those compromises that are made. I think that one of the things that's important to understand here is I really do believe that the Cherokee Nation has every right to define what its own citizenship is. I also believe that it is a sovereign nation, it's a sovereign government, and that we shouldn't look to the federal government to define anything for us, because our history has told us that that relationship is only at the convenience of the federal government. They only make treaties, they only do things that will benefit them. And I think that it's important as indigenous people that we take a stand and we really understand that this framework that they're imposing upon us is not the only way to look at things. It's not the only way to deal with things. And I think that as indigenous people, that once we begin to do that and could recognize what these traps are, and even start to refuse to adopt the language that separates us, refuse to take those weapons that are being used against us, and not have them to continue to harm us. That the dialogue not only about this issue but many others needs to be carried on, and I think it's really important that we do that. And yes, I do encourage you to get that Choctaw citizenship.
All right. I have a challenge for you then. All right? Kind of improvising off this last question. All right. Say that Gifford Tallmadge becomes principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. How do you define inclusive citizenship in light of all that we've been talking about in terms of being a good Cherokee? If people are able to meet, as a criticism I've heard it said, it is easier to become a German citizen than it is to become Cherokee. Right? So if you are going to define, if you're principal chief, how do you define inclusive citizenship so that we can bring strength to the nation?
Well, I think one of the things that we need to look at, too, is why this pressure is suddenly here.
Yeah.
And, a lot of this is related, once again, to that culture outside of us and what's happening there. And the Cherokee Nation is just overwhelmed at this time with applications for citizenship.
For healthcare reasons and
for healthcare reasons.
Reasons that are not so great.
So they may have gotten 800 applications, let's take the figure of around 400 applications a month. They're getting 14,000 a month now.
Wow.
And one of the reasons for this is because of the lack of health care in this country.
Yes.
People understand that there is an Indian health care. If they have a native identity, a card, they can get that care for themselves or for their children. So we have these external pressures that are on us. I would beg to say that probably there is a good deal of those people that are on the freedmen rolls or would like to have members on the freedmen rolls that are also applying for it for that very same reason. I'm not trying to avoid your question, but I'm trying to form a framework for it.
That's a good context.
And I think that if I had that opportunity and we're in that position to really look at how we're going to have this inclusive identity of the Cherokee people, once again, I would try to do what was right, because that truly is what being Cherokee is. And that's to weigh all of those considerations. That's to engage the people that are involved in it. And And so for me to sit here and tell you right now what that answer would be, I would have difficulty in doing that.
Well, if you need an advisor, see, the thing with, I understand those pressures. And for me, taking on a Choctaw identity is not because I want casino money. It's because, there's some value in pushing back when you know that there's a trap there. So do you have any closing comments? Because, we're past the 2-minute mark, and 2 minutes goes fast on TV.
Well, I think how I would like to leave this is to try to get across the complexity of this issue that we've been discussing, and that there is no simple solution, there's no simple answer for it. And I think that within this framework of looking at the Cherokee Nation, the Cherokee people, there have always been this movement, this attempt to protect that identity. And I think that you're seeing that happen right now. And I see people on both sides of that issue having the interest in that. I don't think we can call it good, or I don't think we can call it bad.
Well, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for asking me, Mike.
And go well, stay well. This has been DiversiTV, and we'll see you next week, 6 to 7, with an Anglo perspective. Go well, stay well. Thank you for watching.